thank the escalator, which is this wonderful location, for letting us use it, as well as all our volunteers tonight, Matt, Vlad, Ken, Alex, and everyone who came over to help us set up this space. Have a look at the escalator, by the way. This is the home of Techstars and Working Central. They have all sorts of very interesting stuff for entrepreneurs and so on and so forth. Dev is the other sponsor. So as you know, as I said last time, we're recruiting. We're looking for C++ developers based out of Berlin. And I quote, some badass Qt developers in Amsterdam, as well as 2 generous C++ developer and 1 more Go developer over there. In London, we're looking for communications people, in particular people with experience with social media, writing tutorials, writing articles for the press, and that kind of stuff. So if you're interested, please send an email and your CV to the address that's on the screen now. Thank you.
And if you want to do JavaScript stuff in Silicon Valley, that might also be an option.
And JavaScript in the Silicon Valley.
Sure.
Usually I present a few things on those evenings, but tonight, since it's a special evening, I decided to skip it. Just a quick heads up, next month I'll present a non-trivial dApp to this event. Probably going to be something like a decentralized eBay or a decentralized Uber, leveraging Ethereum to work absolutely without any web servers. It will be also a good place to learn how you can leverage alternatives to Swarm and Whisper until they're being fully developed. And that will be on Friday, the 14th of November, sorry. So without further ado, he flew in just this morning. He had 1 hour of sleep. So please welcome Vitalik Buterin, the inventor and the founder of Ethereum.
By the way, we really should build Jade into whatever development environment we're using, because like coding GUIs in HTML is pretty ugly. Let's see. Grr. Okay. So, and how do I advance and retreat? Spacebar. Okay. So it shows. Okay. So this is something similar to a presentation that I made at the Bitcoin Expo in Toronto about 6 months ago, but here I'm going to have a somewhat different emphasis. So, oh, what did I do? No, back. Sorry. So it's similar to a presentation that I made about 6 months ago in Toronto, but here I'm just shifting the emphasis somewhat. I'm probably going to focus less on the cryptography, more on the game theory and economics. But the general points that I've really started to appreciate more and more as I've come to spend more time developing all these consensus algorithms, scalability algorithms, things on top of cryptoeconomic protocols over the past 6 to 12 months is basically that there's actually a lot of connections between what we're doing with cryptocurrency from an economic standpoint and things that people, societies, economies have been doing really for more than 10,000 years. So basically, we often like to say that Bitcoin is this fundamentally new economic paradigm. It's this next step in human evolution, and obviously cryptocurrency is supposed to replace fiat money like completely and all that. And we've got self-executing contracts and decentralized autonomous corporations and Skynet and so forth. But the point is that all of these constructs that we have, actually pretty much none of them are completely new. Pretty much every single thing on this list, I would even say including decentralized autonomous corporations, is something that's existed in some form, in an economically equivalent form, in some fashion for a really long time. It's just that the difference is this time we're doing it on top of technology. So, to start off, the way I'm going to do the first half of the presentation is basically I'm going to seemingly haphazardly introduce a few interesting and random concepts from game theory and economics. So, first one, if you've done any game theory, if you have done any game theory at all, chances are the single bit of game theory you've done is looking at this chart. Prisoner's dilemma. So this sort of almost founding thought experiment of game theory is that if you imagine a situation where you have 2 prisoners, and each of those prisoners has the opportunity to either basically speak out as a witness against the other prisoner, or say nothing. Now the idea is that if they both say nothing, then chances are they're going to go free. But if they both speak out against each other, then they're both guilty. Each one implicates the other. They're both guilty, and they're going to go to jail for some amount of time. But if one prisoner implicates the second prisoner, and the second prisoner keeps quiet about the first prisoner, then the prisoner who spoke out first of all, he's not going to go to jail because there's no evidence against him, and second, he might actually get an extra reward on top of that. So the point is that in each and the other prisoner is going to go to jail and for a really long time. So the point of this sort of thought experiment is that there's this sort of fundamental strain in game theory between this idea of what's individually rational and what's collectively rational. So from the point of view of each individual prisoner, you want to rat the other guy out because, first of all, if you don't get implicated, then you get a reward. And if you do, and if the other guy does implicate you, then if you rat the other guy out as well, then you're going to get a bit of leniency for that. So from your point of view, ratting the other prisoner out is always a good choice. But from a collective standpoint, if the two prisoners rat each other out, then they're both collectively worse off than if they had both kept quiet. So generalized prisoners, you can actually generalize this game to beyond just two players. So if you imagine a game where you have n players, and the idea is that each player has a strategy of cooperating or a strategy of defecting. So one example of this might be if you have 1,000 factories all around the world, each of them might use an might want to put some filter on their chimney to not emit like toxic pollutants, or they could just take the lazy approach and emit whatever toxic pollutants they want. So from the point of view of if you take the strategy of cheating, of not bothering with your emissions, then from your personal standpoint, that's going to be slightly economically beneficial because, well, you get more profit, and the extra share of pollution that you're inflicting upon the rest of the world, you're only taking a small chunk of a very small part of that yourself. But from a global standpoint, that you're doing something which is incredibly harmful. So if each individual factory all around the world does the thing that's best for themselves, the entire world is basically going to be covered in smog, and it'll look like Beijing in the winter. So the idea of the concept of a Nash equilibrium is basically that a Nash equilibrium is a set of strategies that people play such that from that equilibrium there is no way that any player can benefit by switching to a different strategy. So you can think of a Nash equilibrium as sort of being like a stable state of the game. So if it's a set of strategies where there's no, you could potentially rely on that state actually staying the way it is because nobody has the incentive to jump out of it. So in this case, the Nash equilibrium, unfortunately, well, anyone want to guess what the Nash equilibrium is? At least someone who hasn't seen this thing 10 times yet. Is the Nash equilibrium maybe this? It's the optimal strategy. Is that what Nash equilibrium means? Maybe it's this. No, it's actually this, because if you look from 5-5, both prisoners are cooperating. They're keeping quiet. But if one of them switches to ratting the other prisoner out, then he benefits. So it's not stable. And from here, the prisoner that's cooperating can also switch to defecting. But if both prisoners are defecting, then switching to cooperating is a bad strategy. So it's an equilibrium because no one benefits from deviating. But the point is that even though it's a sort of strategy which is individually rational for everyone, in this particular case, the Nash equilibrium is pretty much the worst possible thing that can happen. So that's one case. So problem is, in the real world, there's going to be a lot of opportunities to cheat. So if you see someone, if you're in a jungle and you see someone with a lot of nice food, you can potentially take a knife, you can kill them, and then you can eat the nice food, and you can eat them as a second course. So if they have gold, so much the better. You get gold. So there's the problem is that if people end up acting in a way that's individually rational in this sort of narrow context, in every case, then you're going to end up with basically the Hobbesian jungle equilibrium, aka life being pretty nasty, brutish, and short for everyone. So, on the other hand, however, we have survived, and we seem to be in a technologically advanced society, hopefully. So, how did we get out? So one approach in where a society can get out of those kinds of Nash equilibrium is basically to have a punishment process. So the idea is that if, let's say, I'm going around, I see that you have a lot of food, and I take the knife, I kill you, and I eat your food, and I eat you as a second course. Now, by default, I benefit, but then society agrees that this behavior is, quote, bad, and we'll treat bad as a sort of arbitrary symbol. And the idea is that society agrees to specifically punish people that engage in this behavior that we have tagged bad. So you can model punishment as an action which costs a certain amount of resources for yourself, but also is extremely harmful to the victim. So it seems like a very wasteful thing to do. Why would you want to do something which harms everyone? But the point of punishment is that it changes the incentives. So if you look at the previous chart and you sort of add this punishments to it, then you can see how instead of my individual calculation being, well, okay, either I go on my merry way or I kill this guy and I get his food. Now it's either I go on my merry way or I kill this guy and I get his food, but then I get a whole bunch of other nasty consequences coming for me afterwards. So given that if there is an expectation that there will be punishment, that changes the incentive for defecting, and therefore people are no longer going to defect, and therefore the whole thing actually improves everyone's welfare altogether. Problem is, what's the incentive to punish? So that's, why would anyone do this sort of minus 0.5, minus 5 behavior? Why would you want to sacrifice half a point of utility? So the solution that, once again, people have come up with is this idea that we basically make punishment mandatory. So we say that if you do not participate in the process of punishment, then you yourself become an outlaw and you yourself are subject to punishment. So in this sort of caveman example, we can imagine society having some rule that, let's say you got 30 people, let's say you got 365 people in this tribe. Each of them gets assigned a day of the year, and on some day of the year, on your day of the year, if someone does something bad, then you're required to punish them, and if you don't, then the next day you get punished yourself, and that sort of works. And in sort of a somewhat more civilized environments, one example is tax-funded police forces. So everyone's not required to actually participate in the whole process of going and whacking people directly, but they're required to send a certain amount of money to a group of specialized agents that are specifically intended to punish people. Another example of that is social ostracism. So this is actually something that you see in a lot of societies that are sort of embedded within other societies and even persecuted to some degree. So David Friedman has some interesting materials on which is basically like an analysis on how Gypsy society works. And the thing with the Gypsy culture is that they're basically a society embedded inside of a larger one, but they don't really have the ability to impose their own courts and their own sort of formal laws to a certain degree. So instead, they rely heavily on social ostracism. And the way social ostracism works is it's also recursive. So if I do something bad, then everyone else is not going to associate with me. Now, why won't everyone else associate with me? Because the rule that society has is that if you associate with someone who got ostracized, then you yourself become a member of this class of ostracized people. And then other people have to ostracize you as well. And if they don't, then they get ostracized as well. So the whole thing is a sort of self-supporting equilibrium. So this is basically the major reason why we are not all dead right now. So now I'm going to look at this problem of why we act in a civilized way. There's actually another sort of angle you can take at it. So another concept in game theory is this idea of Schelling points. So let's say you imagine that two prisoners in separate rooms, they both see these 8 numbers. And to each prisoner, the guard says, if you give the same number, if you give the same, you have to give me one of these 8 numbers. If you give the same number as the other prisoner, then both of you go free. Otherwise, we're going to torture and kill both of you slowly and painfully. So, given these 8 numbers, let's say you are this prisoner in this room, someone, which number would you give? Okay. So I see a lot of votes. I see a lot of votes for 100,000. Can anyone say why you decided to pick 100,000? Hey, it's special. That's pretty much exactly the reason. It's special, and you expect that the other prisoner also has this idea that the number is special, and therefore there's this sort of recursive idea that you know it's special, you know that they know it's special, you know that they know that you know it's special, and therefore you sort of coordinate on this number without ever actually communicating with each other. Now, note that this is actually culturally dependent. So suppose that if we go on Mars, and on Mars people don't speak in base 10, they speak in base 9. And in that case, people are going to pick 59049 because that's 9 to the 5. And they're going to wonder, what the heck is this 100,000 thing? It's just a random number. So now what's an application of a Schelling point? So here's one example. So here's just another example of another game. So let's say everyone has you have 2 players, they have 2 moves, attack or retreat. So you can imagine this as like two animals or even 2 people wander into some territory, and they have a choice, and they sort of see each other in the distance, and they have a choice of do they go back or do they move forward. If both of them press forward, then they're going to end up fighting each other, and they're both going to get very injured, probably to an extent greater than the value of whatever they're fighting over. If one attacks and the other retreats, then he wins. And if both of them retreat, then they both do reasonably well, and they're eventually sort of going to be able to take roughly half the resource. So, what are the Nash equilibria of this thing? First of all, 0-0 is not a Nash equilibrium because, well, either party can benefit by retreating. 4-4 is also not a Nash equilibrium because, if both parties retreat, then either party can benefit by attacking. But this guy's a Nash equilibrium. The first guy attacks, the second guy retreats. And this guy's a Nash equilibrium. The first guy retreats, the second guy attacks. So there's actually 2 distinct equilibria, one of which favors A and one of which favors B. So actually now let's add in a third little rule to this game. Let's add in a rule that every time this game is played, we also, the entity that's running the game also just gives both A and B some arbitrary number as a tag. So it just generates a random number in the set 0 to 100, and it says that, and just provides that number to both of them. The number itself doesn't signify anything. Now suppose that we rename player A player 0, and we rename player B player 100. Now suppose that, here is another equilibrium that actually might end up happening. What if you have an equilibrium? You could have an equilibrium where player A and player B both agree that if this number that they get is less than 50, then A attacks and B retreats. And if it's greater than 50, then B attacks and A retreats. So in this case, it's basically going to, so if we imagine that if both of them retreat, this situation is going to it might be slightly smaller because, well, it's not really efficient if both of you just leave this territory unoccupied. Then what you get there is you basically get a situation where essentially A is sort of like claiming the numerical space between 0 and 50 as its own property, and B is claiming the space between 50 and 100 as its own property, and the whole thing kind of works. So this basically is another explanation of that some economists give of why property rights work. So, new category of problem, coordination problem. So, 2 players, A and B. Over here you have 2-2 and 4-4. These guys are both Nash equilibria because if you're over here, then neither party has the incentive to switch, and if you're over here, neither party has the incentive to switch. Now, problem is, let's say you have 2 players, they're both at A. The question is, how do you coordinate on moving from A to B? Now, with 2 people, it's not hard. You just call them on the phone, and you say, oh, hey, both of us might get an extra 2 utility points if we both use B. Okay, we'll both play B this time. Done. Problem is, what if there's 1 million people? So practical example, spelling reform. So right now, everyone spells English words weirdly. They do things like caug for cough, and caug and denog don't rhyme for some reason, and neither do fraked and haked. So one option is a possibility is what if we replace this stupid system with proper reformed spelling like cough and enough and freight and height, and it'll be easier to learn and more efficient for everyone. So we modify. So we can model this equilibrium with +1 points for everyone. We modify we formalize this with +1, and we say this is +2. But why doesn't this happen? Basically, the reason is that if you as an individual go ahead and you reform your spelling, then other people are going to have no idea what the heck you're saying. So other people's utility is going to go down slightly, and your utility is going to go down a lot. And now, notice that it's a different situation from the sort of prisoner's dilemma factories polluting situation, right? Because there, when you had 1,000 factories polluting, we also had this idea that if everyone did B rather than A, then things would be better. But each individual has the incentive to do A rather than B. Here it's a bit different. Here, each individual has the incentive to do what the majority is doing. So if the whole thing actually managed to somehow get over to B, then everyone would actually have the incentive to stick there and would actually be a stable Nash equilibrium. So if everyone else reformed their spelling and you didn't, then they would eventually, as people forgot the old ways, and their children came along and they never learned the stupid old ways, they would not even be able to understand you. They would wonder, what is this enog word that he is trying to write? So, coordination problem. Another example is the revolution. No one participates, okay, things are pretty bad. Everyone participates, okay, things are pretty good. You participate in the revolution, but the others don't. You kind of die. Others participate, you don't. Then things go fairly well, but you have a lower status in the revolution. So that's just another coordination problem. Now here's another one. Here's another way of looking at revolutions, though. Let's say that there's a social norm against killing the king and usurping the throne. Everyone agrees that killing the king and usurping the throne is bad. Divine right of kings and all that. Now here's the problem. Let's say that the current king gets killed. Then let's say that society assumes that if the current king is killed, then the norm disappears, and it becomes fair game for everyone to try to take power. So here's what happens. Suppose that no king has been killed yet. Now I'm over here. Let's say Vlad is the king, and I'm thinking, should I kill Vlad and usurp the throne, or should I not kill Vlad? Now, here's the thing. If I do right now, I know that there is this norm against killing the king, and that everything is fine. But if I do kill Vlad, then I know that the norm is going to disappear, and because the norm is going to disappear, there will no longer be a reason for Stefan not to go and kill me in turn. So the idea here is that it's a sort of equilibrium that sort of reinforces itself in this very strange way, where the reason why. So first of all, right now, I'm not usurping Vlad because I know that if I do usurp Vlad, then the argument against usurping the king is no longer going to exist. And if I do usurp Vlad, then that same argument doesn't exist because this sort of social norm is already dead and there's nothing else left to lose. So this is so out of fear of the whole thing degenerating, no one's going to kill Vlad in the first place. So this is something that's often called a Grim-Sugar equilibrium. Now, completely different tangent. Bounded rationality. So this is so in all of these models, we simply assume that people want the thing that gives them the highest score. So in reality, people don't always act in a way that optimizes any particular scoring function. So generally, people have a bias towards selecting a relatively simple strategy and consistently following it. So common simple strategy, aka heuristic that people follow is if they see a guy in a suit, then the guy's clearly a professional. There's also an interesting article from good old David Friedman again. He just writes a lot about Schelling points And this particular one is on virtue. And so his are basically the question that he raised is why do people act virtuously even in situations where if they cheat they're clearly not going to get caught. So one argument is that the strategy of just always being nice is simple, but the strategy of being nice except in situations where you clearly could get away with it is more complex, and it's harder for a person to consistently follow. So therefore, if you're going to be sort of conditionally virtuous, and there's some problem, then every time you compromise the purity of your virtue, there's always some possibility that eventually you're going to slip up, and you're going to be less convincing. So it basically the fact that people have an easier time processing more simple strategies than complex ones is what ends up driving people to actually, or is one of the things that ends up driving people to actually be nice rather than trying to say, oh, I'm going to be more on a case-by-case basis and so forth. So if you're interested, there's the link. So now on to applications. So stones of Rye are I'm going to call them one of the first cryptocurrencies. So there is a small tribe this is a real story. There's a small tribe on the island of Yap around the year 1900. Rye stone, and on this island, they use these things called rye stones as money. The stones were very big. Like this, you might think about 3 to 4 meters. The stones never moved, right? And the ownership just changed by collective agreement. So if one tribe if 2 tribes came together and one tribe wanted to trade ownership of a rye stone in exchange for a big, huge packet of food and medicine, then the second tribe would actually move the packet of food and medicine over to the first tribe's village. But the first tribe wouldn't do anything. It would just say, okay, I hereby say that this rye stone, which belongs to me, now belongs to you. And a bunch of people would observe the transaction, and soon enough, everyone would know that particular rye stone now belongs to tribe 2 instead of tribe 1. Now, if tribe 1 tries to use that rye stone again, then then people are going to say, hey guys, are you crazy? You gave the rye stone to tribe 2 already. Now, as it turns out, this whole rye stone system was actually incredibly robust. So as one example, at one point, some tribesmen managed to bring a rye stone, or tried to bring a rye stone from another island to the main island, but the boat sank and the stone dropped to the bottom of the ocean. Now, the stone was very large, and people knew that it existed, but no one knew exactly where it was, and no one knew how to find it. Even still, the stone had a market value. Another example, at one point, the Germans invaded this island, and at first, they wanted these locals to do some work for them. So initially, the locals refused. Then what the Germans did was they got up to the stones, and they just drew an X on some of the stones with a marker, and then they said, we have taken your stones. Now we're holding them for ransom. Do some work for us. So these people on the island of Yap basically capitulated and ended up doing the work that the Germans wanted. And at the end of the day, the Germans went ahead and they scrubbed off the X with a marker, and they left. Transaction complete. So basically, these people, they valued the integrity of their financial system so much that they were willing to let their entire tribe get extorted for it. So that has some interest. That sounds stupid to some degree, but that actually has some interesting parallels that I'm going to get back to later. So here's another interesting one. Most people don't really think about this, but markets are actually also a recursive punishment system. So this is just another. People often ask, why does a Bitcoin have value, or why does a dollar have value? So let's assume that there's a default strategy, a cooperative strategy, which is that you act as if a dollar is worth some amount. Now, first, there's 2 ways to defect from that strategy. One strategy is to act as if a dollar is worth less than that. So, but the problem is, if you do that, and if you act as if a dollar, Actually, these should be flipped. If you act as if a dollar is worth more than that, then you end up working too hard, and you're not really willing to spend your dollar. So you work harder, you enjoy less products and services, and you're worse off. Option 2, you undervalue the dollar. If you undervalue the dollar, then you get another problem, which is you spend stuff too quickly and you exhaust all your money before you see the best possible options for spending it. So why do both of these things happen? Both of those consequences occur because people value a dollar, because other people are valuing a dollar at that particular amount. So if instead other people valued a dollar at 10x, then the optimal strategy would be for you to value a dollar at the same price as them. So this is just another model for understanding why things that have zero intrinsic value end up actually having a value. It's basically, the market's punishing you, invisible fist and all that. Reputation, also an interesting thing to analyze. So we have this idea in society that doing certain things increases your reputation. So one incentive that people have is they have the incentive to trust reputable people more. So there's actually two reasons why I want to do that. The first reason is more obvious, which is if someone's reputable, they have an established pattern of being nice, and so you think that they're more likely to actually be nice next time. The second reason is sort of a more game theoretical one, which is that if someone has a valuable reputation, then because of that they have more to lose if they get caught cheating you, and therefore they have a stronger incentive not to cheat you, and therefore because of that you should trust them more. So the interesting thing with that argument is that particular argument that actually works with any set of rules. So in our society we have this rule that that you become reputable if you do things like donating to charity, volunteering, being involved in cool open source projects, etc. In some other society, you could have a system where people are assumed to be reputable if they are good at gathering large collections of paper clips in their house. Now, if the society has this rule, the whole thing would actually still work, because if you have a large collection of paper clips in your house, then you have a higher reputation, you have more to lose, and people have more incentive to trust you. So the whole thing just sort of maintains itself. So obviously, the second example in this case is a lot flimsier than the first, because part of the purpose of reputation is that it shows that someone has a predictable pattern of behaving in a certain way, whereas the paperclip example relies purely on the sort of game theoretic more to lose argument. But the point is that both of them apply to some extent. Last example, courts. So what is a court? Basically, it's a sort of hierarchical system of increasing attention on some particular dispute. So by default, people are peaceful, they go about their business. You can think of that as being low attention. In the case of a dispute, if you have a dispute with someone, then you might go to court. And if you go to court, then basically society places a medium amount of attention on investigating the situation and figuring out who's actually right. If the debate is hotly contested, then it goes into higher court and eventually Supreme Court, and that's high attention. So that's basically one model of roughly how court works and what the value of it is. Cases that are large and important get more attention, and cases that are very small, cases that are easily resolvable, get low attention. And in some cases, the threat of attention deters things from happening in the first place. Another problem that courts solve is how do you obtain an estimate of what a community norm is? One option is to escalate things to a Supreme Court. Another option is you just pick 12 random people, and chances are they're going to roughly represent the average. This is called a jury. So, however, this is not so much courts, this is a general problem of law enforcement, which is it's a somewhat mathematical argument, but problem is basically crime is never going to go to, or malfeasance in general is probably never going to go to exactly zero. Now, the reason is that the incentive to spend effort on trying to deter crime is basically proportional to how much success you can get for every unit of effort. But the thing is, if the amount of crime is approaching zero, then the extra gains that you can get from expending large amounts of effort become very small as well. And if there is no crime, then no one would bother catching criminals, which makes no sense, because if no one tries to catch criminals, then criminals are going to run rampant because no one's going to catch them. So the problem is it's like one of those hawk-dove situations. depending on the amount of enforcement, there's going to be some level of bad activity, and that level is unfortunately going to be greater than 0. Hopefully very small, but greater than 0 in just about every case. So now's the part where it gets actually to a cryptocurrency stuff. So blockchains, first of all, what is a blockchain? It's a distributed database. So a distributed database has a state. It has a meaning assigned to the state, and it has a state transition rule. State transition rule is basically a rule for how the state updates itself. So you go for, the basic formula is you take a state, you take a transaction, and applying the transaction to the state either gives you a new state or it tells you that the transaction is invalid in the context of that state. So just to show how this works, provide an example. Bitcoin. So the state is a bunch of accounts and their balances. Now I know in reality it uses a solid spread transaction output system, which in my opinion is stupider than a balance-based system. So we're going to pretend it's a balance-based system. So that's the state. It's a key value map of address to numbers. Now what's the meaning of the state? The meaning is that the balance represents currency units. If there is a number, of 1.5 million or 150 million beside your address, it means that you have 1.5 BTC. Now, what's the state transition rule? Well, if the state has a particular has some number beside your address, and that number is greater than the amount that you're trying to send, then the state transition rule is that in the next state, your balance is going to get subtracted by the amount you want to send, and the recipient's balance is going to get added by the amount you want to send. So basically, that's basically the definition of a currency. First of all, it's a thing which follows the law of conservation of total value, or at least in the case of transactions, and it's a system where you need people's consent in order to negatively affect their balances. So I'd argue that basically something that follows those two rules is a currency. So that's one example of how to use a blockchain. You use it to store balances. Another example is Namecoin. So Namecoin basically tries to apply blockchain technology to domain name registration. So in this case, the database is not used to store how much money people have. Well, okay, in actual Namecoin it is, because Namecoin has a currency in it for some reason. Like Namecoin really should just be a contract on top of a more generalized platform, but whatever. So Namecoin, in the simplified version, the database is, okay, you have domain names. You have Google. In Namecoin's case, the three-letter domain is .bit. So you have, instead of google.com, you would have google.bit, you would have bitcoin.bit, ethereum.bit, namecoin.bit, and so forth. And each domain is mapped to an owner, basically, the public key that controls the domain. The meaning of the database is that if I want to access a website, then I can ask the Namecoin blockchain what IP address I should query. And the state transition rule is, well, if a domain has not yet been registered and you send a transaction to register it, then the database updates to register that particular domain name with your address. Land registry is another example. So land registries, they map basically coordinates, or realistically squares or polygons of land on Earth to owners. And the meaning of a land registry is, if someone does something inside of that territory without the owner's permission, then whack them, or realistically send everyone is required to send tax funds to a group of specialized agents who are going to whack them, as we discussed in one of the first slides. And what is the state transition rule? That's going to be a bit complicated, and it depends on whether you want to build what kinds of title transfers you want to build in. Do you want to build in rental? Do you want to build in property taxes? Do you want to build in eminent domain? Whatever you build, it depends. It could potentially get complicated. So, what is a blockchain from a technical standpoint? It's a series of blocks. Every block contains a hash of the previous block, so every block points to the previous block. And there's a scoring function on blocks, at least in the sort of proof of work case. So you can think of the score of the genesis as being 0, and the score of any block is the score of the parent plus the amount of computational work that was put in to creating the block. So over here, if we assume that each block takes like a normalized 1 unit of computational effort to create, then this guy has a score of 122, this guy's 123, 124, 125, and this guy's going to have 126. And the current state of the system is assumed to be the block with the highest score. Now, blocks are created through computational effort. They're created through this process called mining. Now, what is mining? Miners basically spend computational effort producing blocks, and they get rewarded. And if they produce a block successfully, they get 25 BTC. Now, the point is that mining is a game. Miners have the option to either not mine, in which case, for sometimes not mining is the optimal strategy. So right now, if you have anything other than one of those crazy ASICs that are being created in Shenzhen, your optimal strategy might not be to mine at all. But if we assume that the mining system is fair, then for most people, it's more profitable to mine than not to mine. But then they have a choice: which of these blocks do they mine on top of? And if they mine on top of one of these blocks, do they want to create a valid block, or do they want to create an invalid block that somehow benefits them? So 4 ways to deviate. One way is to create a block that includes an invalid transaction that gives the miner some extra Bitcoins. Another option is send out the block, not bother with adding proof of work on it. Save electricity, why not? It's environmentally friendly. Third option, if there's another invalid block that favors them, they can mine on top of that invalid block. And the fourth option is they mine on top of a block that's valid, but that's suboptimally scoring. So one example is that suppose that in chain 122, or in block 122, I have 200 Bitcoins. In 123, I send 100 Bitcoins to an exchange, and that exchange gives me 20 million Dogecoins. Now, okay, I have 20 million Dogecoins, 124, 125. Now, here's the problem, situation. So in 122, I had 200 Bitcoins. In 126, I'm down to 100 Bitcoins. But here's what I can do. I can create a block 123 such that that version of block 123 does not include the transaction me sending the Bitcoins to the exchange. And instead, it's going to include a transaction sending those same Bitcoins to a new account controlled by myself. So in 123, I have 200 Bitcoins. Now, why would I want to mine on 120? Why do I want to mine 123? Why do I want to support 123? Because if the 123 chain wins, then I get all my Bitcoins back. And because Dogecoin is in a separate chain, I still have my Dogecoin, so it's a win-win. Except obviously for the exchange. And for the exchange, it's a lose-lose. But who cares? It's an exchange. Hopefully Mt. Gox. So why would any miner that buys a bunch of Dogecoins on an exchange not want to do this? Basically, why would a miner act honestly? There's clearly large incentives to act dishonestly here. So the problem is, if you create an invalid block, then other miners are not going to mine on the block. Why aren't other miners going to mine on the block? Because there is a rule, which is that a block that depends on an invalid block. So it's either a block on top of an invalid block or a block on top of a block on top of an invalid block. Those blocks are also invalid. And we just set that as a rule, and we define it that way. And miners don't want to produce invalid blocks. Why don't miners want to produce invalid blocks? Because if they produce invalid blocks, then other miners will not mine on it, and the reason they don't want to mine on it is because they don't want to produce invalid blocks. So to some extent, it's a circular argument, but really, it's a self-reinforcing Nash equilibrium. It's a recursive punishment system. So basically, the same game theory that is the reason why you're still alive is also the reason why the Bitcoin blockchain is still alive. Now, there's also similar logic for blocks that have a low score. So in this case, this block is going to give me an extra 100 Bitcoins, but if I mine on it, then other miners are not going to want to mine on it. The reason is that if they create a block 124 on top of my 123, then other miners are not going to mine 120. Other miners are still going to prefer mining on top of 126 because it's longer. So basically, the problem is that, theoretically, it is possible that every single miner at the same time is going to switch over from mining here to mining on here. But the idea is that requires cooperation from so many people at the same time, it's just not going to happen. So this sort of fuzzy idea that that it's the whole thing is the whole system relies on a large group of people not being able to coordinate. I've described that as saying that that consensus algorithms rely on market failure as a security assumption. So that's something I'll go into a bit more detail. There's actually a couple interesting subtleties if you go into that a bit further. But in any case, so here's another question. Okay, we know why miners mine on the main chain. Why do users care about the main chain? Why do users care about the chain that has, why do users care about this, why do users assign a value of 380 USD to each Bitcoin on this chain, but a value of like 0 USD to each Bitcoin on this chain? Why can't it be the other way around? Why can't people assign the value to the chain that has the largest number of hashes that are prime numbers? So it sounds like basically answer one is it's a Schelling point, which basically means that okay, everyone does have the expectation that they value this at 380 and this at 0. And if you personally value this at 340 and this at 40, then guess what? You're going to end up buying up a lot of coins here, but all of that hard work is going to be wasted because you're going to get a bunch of coins that are going to be that nobody else will accept. And over here, if you value the coins here at 340, then your chances are you're going to sell all your coins and you're going to lose some money here. So basically, having valuations for things that are not consistent with everyone else's valuations is a losing game for you. Now, that's one reason. Now, there's also another argument, which is, now saying it's a Schelling point, it's actually a bit stronger than a Schelling point. The reason is that why are coins here more valuable than the coins on the chain with the largest quantity of prime numbers? And the basic reason is that if you look at coins that are on the longest chain, then if you look at that as a currency system, that is basically maximally difficult to attack. So miners are going to, it's maximally difficult for an attacker to start from 122 and make a big huge chain that overtakes 126. On the other hand, if you care about the chain that has the largest number of prime numbers, well, miners don't particularly care about that, and so it's going to be relatively easy to double spend you. Now, of course, the interesting thing is that argument sort of, like both of those equilibria kind of depend on each other. So it kind of, like the point is that when you successfully mine a block, you don't just gain 25 BTC as an abstract thing. You gain 25 BTC in the block that you mined. So theoretically, it is kind of possible that both of those equilibria are going to be different, and people accept that the valuable chain is a chain that has the largest number of blocks with prime numbers in it, and miners trying to mine on that chain, in which case it actually is going to be the hardest one to attack. So why is it this way and not that way? In part, it's a Schelling point argument, and in part, it's because it's just simpler. So moving on a bit further. So another random aside, this concept of smart contracts. So in a regular contract, I agree to give you $300 if you perform task X. If you do perform task X and I don't give you $300, I have that choice. However, if I have that choice, then you'll have the ability to sue me, and the collection of specialized agents that we all pay taxes to might end up whacking me and forcing me to give you the money. Now, there's also this other approach, which is smart contracts. So here it's a different paradigm. It's I put $300 into a box, and those $300 are automatically assigned to you if you do X. So in order to see an example of how that might actually be verifiable, imagine doing X as solving some math problem. Let's say providing a number which satisfies some particular mathematical property. So it's hard to find the number, but if you do find the number, it's easy to check. So what you can do is you can create an Ethereum contract which actually does the checking, and if it finds a valid solution, it would automatically send the funds over. Now, from a philosophical standpoint, what did we just do here? Basically, what we've done is we've created a cryptographic system that controls some internal asset, and that internal asset has emergent value. It has no intrinsic value. It only has value because we care about it. And this idea of a consensus system creating this sort of scarce asset provides a sort of door from the world of cryptography into the real world. It's if you imagine some of those movies where you have viruses inside of computers, and then some magic portal appears, and those viruses can leave the computer and actually start wreaking havoc in New York. I don't know if any such movie actually exists, but something like it should. That's basically roughly kind of what this is. Like basically, as soon as you have a decentralized consensus framework that controls an internal asset, and there's this valuation equilibrium where people care about it, as soon as that happens, the crypto system has the ability to have real-world consequences, even though by itself it's just a crypto system. It's just a bunch of numbers. So the idea is that what happens here is that you are basically making the statement, I hereby give $300 to open bracket you if you solve the problem, otherwise myself, close bracket. And so you can think of it. So first of all, if you think about it from the point of view of the rhinestones, in the case of the rhinestones, you can say, I hereby give this rhinestone to you, and then everyone accepts that the rhinestone belongs to you. Here, what I'm saying is, I give $300 to open bracket you if you solve the math problem, otherwise myself, close bracket, and you could imagine this being done in the context of this rhinestone community, but it seems, and you could imagine that if you solve the math problem, then without further involvement from myself, if you solve the math problem, then the community consensus is going to be that the rhinestone actually belongs to you. And if you don't solve the math problem, then the community consensus is going to be that the rhinestone still belongs to me. So here what we have is we're basically taking that exact same paradigm and we're just using digital technology to formalize it and make it much more efficient and make it viable. Problem with smart contracts, how do you verify them? Obviously verifiability. So proving a theorem, pure math, extremely verifiable. Sometimes a smart contract might depend on some global fact. So you could have a derivative on the temperature of San Francisco. You could have a derivative on the price of a US dollar. You could have a bet on the population of China divided by the population of India squared. And the thing with all of those facts is that even though you can't cryptographically verify them directly, you can still roughly say that they're. So there's so many different sources of data that can potentially provide that information that you can basically construct protocols to put the data into the blockchain. So you could do like 5n of 9 oracles. You can do shell coin. There's a bunch of different ideas. But the place where smart contracts are hard is basically local facts. A fact that only 2 or 3 people in the world care about. In this case, did you wash my car? The ultimate local fact. There's not going to be like 9 different data sources from all around the world with Bloomberg and Google and the U.S. government providing an API for whether or not you washed my car. And maybe the NSA has an API for that, but unfortunately it's not public. Yeah. So. The idea is that we can enforce the rules without needing any kind of real-world enforcement by using crypto subsidies. And this idea can potentially have some applications. We don't really know exactly to what extent. So here's where we get into the fun part. So this is basically an interesting sort of a hypothetical attack on proof of work. So suppose that you have an Ethereum contract. The rules for the Ethereum contract are any miner can join, and when you join, you have to send a pretty large deposit into the contract. Now, while you have your deposit into the contract, you as a miner have to send shares. You have to send basically partially completed blocks that you mined into the contract, and the contract verifies those shares, and by doing so, the contract verifies that you're a miner and you actually have some amount of hash power. So then what happened? First of all, before 60% of the proof of work of the entire network joins, miners can send a specific transaction, they can leave at any time, and they can get their deposit back. But once it gets to 60%, the deposits are locked, and the only way everyone gets their deposits back is if a 20+ block fork succeeds in the blockchain. So first of all, let's analyze this game theoretically. Let's say the contract just started. As a miner, do you want to join or do you not want to join? Let's say that first of all, there's no risk because you can leave at any time. And there's a possible reward, which is you can make a fork and that fork might end up being profitable. Might end up being profitable for you because you can use some money, you can buy some Dogecoin, you can reverse the transaction. Get Doge for free. Now, once the whole thing gets to 60%, the incentive to follow through is the deposit. So the contract continues requiring everyone to keep on sending shares, and everyone's required. First of all, everyone has the private incentive to keep on sending shares to prove that they're still to prove to the contract that they're still mining. And here the contract can actually add the restriction that those shares cannot be shares on top of the main chain. They have to be on top of a fork. And then on top of that, once all of these miners, once the 60% of the network is stuck inside of this mechanism, they have the incentive to basically coordinate on some kind of block that reverses a whole bunch of transactions at the same time, maybe robs pretty much every exchange on the system simultaneously. And they coordinate on the transaction, they figure out the one that's roughly the most profitable for all of them. And then eventually one of them is going to look more plausible, and it's going to turn into a Schelling point, and that's the one that all the miners are going to focus on. And because they're 60% of the network, they're going to win. So once it gets to 60%, the incentive to follow through is, first of all, your deposit, second of all, your potential gains. So this whole thing so if you take this whole argument literally, basically you could say that if every single agent acted in a game theoretically rational way, this could end up breaking a proof of work algorithm in some circumstances. Now, first of all, question is, does it actually? Does the game theory actually say so? Or perhaps is there some other argument that we're missing? So basically what this is at first, it's just a general device for solving a coordination problem. Theoretically, you could sort of remove all this part about mining, and you could have a contract, maybe that you're going to need a lot of like specialized judges for it, but you could have a contract that says, okay, before 60 million people join, anyone can join at any time, and anyone can leave at any time. Once 60 million people join, everyone has to switch to using reformed spelling. And if they don't switch to reformed spelling after 60 million people join, then they lose their deposit. So basically, before 60 million people join, you have, joining is free, whatever. You have the ability, you put in a deposit, but you have the ability to leave at any time. After 60 million people join, there's this sort of extra coercive mechanism that forces all the participants to switch over to the new system. And because there's enough of a critical mass, by the end of it, the 60% are sort of able to shift the balance, the entire equilibrium into the other direction, and then hopefully everyone else will just join on to the reform spelling, because otherwise no one's going to understand them if they keep on writing in Naug. So yeah, is something like this. Is like a cryptoeconomic sort of voluntary coercion protocol like this actually going to end up solving coordination problems in the real world? Who knows, it might. So first of all, going back to the proof of work problem. So let's take the Grim Trigger argument. We don't want to kill Vlad, because if I kill Vlad, then Stefan's going to kill me. So basically over here, it's the exact same thing. So right now, if miners actually follow through and do this, then the argument is that then a single case of that happening is going to legitimize that same thing happening for everyone. And once that happens, then those miners are going to end up being victims, and their chains are going to be the ones that get forked. And eventually, that entire currency's value is just going to tend to zero, because everything keeps on getting double spent all over the place. So you can sort of make that exact same argument as in the case of Don't Kill King Vlad over here, but. So the question is, in what cases does the Grim Trigger argument work, and in what cases does the Grim Trigger argument fail? So if the miners are fungible, if there's lots of different coins and miners aren't really loyal to any particular coin, then the argument fails, and potentially this might be an actual attack. You could imagine in Ethereum, so for something like one of the smaller currencies, like Monero, you could actually imagine an Ethereum contract gathering together hash power, potentially even hash power from other chains, and then forcing all of that hash power to coordinate on making a huge Monero double spend. And then they're going to get a whole bunch of winnings. Monero's value is going to crash to zero, but all the miners aren't going to care, because they still have all those other coins to mine. So if mining is fungible, then the Grim Trigger argument fails, and this might actually work. Now, if miners are bound in some way, if miners have nowhere to go but the one coin, then the argument actually works. Because if a coin's value drops to zero, then it hurts everyone. So an interesting conclusion of this is actually, it sort of goes against part of what my crypto political platform has been in the past 6 months, which is that specialized hardware is terrible and it creates centralization, which is absolutely harmful for the ecosystem. That's still true, but on the other hand, in this particular case, specialized hardware might actually help, because if you imagine you have miners with Bitcoin ASICs, then even though there are lots of other currencies, even if you take something like Litecoin, there's lots of other currencies. Some of them are relatively similar in size to Litecoin. Now, Problem is, if Litecoin disappears, then those ASICs have nowhere else to go. The particular specialized hardware is not useful for anything else. So in that case, this sort of investment into specialized hardware becomes a form of sort of non-transferable stake in the system, and that actually makes the Grim Sugar argument work, which therefore makes this takeover attack not work, because the reason why the takeover attack doesn't work is because ultimately, if at the end of the whole thing it hurts everyone, then no one's going to want to join, and no one's going to want to participate. So basically, the problem now, and if the algorithm is CPU based, then the Grim Sugar argument fails because you can switch to another coin. Unless, two possibilities. One possibility is there's only one chain. So if you imagine Bitcoin had an ASIC-resistant proof-of-work algorithm, then because Bitcoin is so much larger than everything else, the Grim Sugar argument would still work on Bitcoin. Or the other hypothesis is, what if this sort of Grim Sugar equilibrium exists, and it actually exists across every chain at the same time? So if one of these takeover attacks happens on Monero, then that legitimizes other attacks happening on other cryptocurrencies as well. So whether or not people actually have that set of expectations is basically an empirical question. I'm not sure. I don't particularly know the answer to that. If it's true, then the argument applies, and we perhaps even have less to worry about. If it's not true, or at least we have less to worry about as from a percentage standpoint, but the black swan case is a bit more dangerous. Or on the other hand, each coin could fall separately. Now, there's actually a way to combine. Now, potentially, we could still rescue CPU algorithms here. So what you say is, in order to participate as a CPU miner, you would basically have to provide a bond, and that bond would give you the right to mine up to a certain amount. So if you provide a bond of a certain number of BTC, then that gives you the ability to mine a maximum of that number of blocks, or maximum that number of shares, or whatever. So that basically forces all of the miners to also have some stake in the system, because their bond is denominated in the currency, and that currency, if the currency's value drops to 0, then they crash and burn along with it. Now, obviously, they can cancel the whole thing out with a financial derivative, but we know in reality that, first of all, there's this whole default effect and people don't do that. Second of all, financial derivatives are not zero cost, and they all end up having these weird black swan cases and so forth. So this might actually be another sort of interesting kind of proof of stake worth researching. Now, last point, software. So there's a funny thing we see in the Bitcoin protocol. In the Bitcoin protocol, we see that there's a lot of these funny altruistic actions that nodes in the protocol make. One example is responding to GET block messages. If I ask for a block with some particular hash or some particular number, for some reason other nodes in the network answer. Why do they answer? Why do they spend the electricity? They don't get anything from it. Now, you might think, okay, it's because nodes are altruistic. The problem is it's not really explainable by altruism per se. And the obvious reason why is that Bitcoin core dev is horribly underfunded. And if people are actual altruists, they will donate $50 each to developers, but they don't. So why does this kind of altruism, the software kind of altruism exist and the human kind of altruism not exist? Basically because arguably, as I made, which is the point that I made in a blog post about a month ago, the correct model for a lot of these systems is to actually think of them as having two different kinds of agents. So one kind of agent is software. Now the interesting thing is that software is a strategy, and software has, first of all, software does have some bias towards simplicity, although a bit less of one. But in general, you can think of software as sort of being similar to a heuristic, to software online as being the equivalent of a heuristic offline. And the second kind of agent is, of course, users. And what users do is they download and run the software that they think is best for them. So they choose among a limited set of options. And they often stick to defaults, although if the software has settings, they might end up changing them. So this kind of model, this is perfectly explained, because the software writers, they're relatively large entities, and so they have the incentive to build in altruistic behaviors into the clients, because once they build in those behaviors, like at least the 20% of the network that runs that particular client is going to have that behavior, and so that's a pretty large benefit, and they'll be able to benefit, and they'll sufficiently benefit from that gain to justify the cost. And users go along because, well, for them, the cost of those extra few hundred bytes of bandwidth and a few nanowatts of electricity is actually less than the cost of going in personally and trying to figure out how the heck to compile a C++ program. So a model of defaults is to model them basically as friction. So, the way friction works is the force of friction always counteracts motion, and the magnitude of friction, is in the physics case, it's this weird mu factor multiplied by the mass multiplied by the gravity. So, one particular consequence is that potentially, a lot of people argue that there is only going to be one currency, and the reason is that larger currencies are superior to small currencies because they have more liquidity, and so because of that, there's going to be this inherent centralizing effect toward fewer and fewer currencies at the same time. Problem is, from a software bounded rationality perspective, you can actually make the opposite argument, which is that software writers have the incentive to build in their own currencies, because if you control a currency, then you can use that currency to incentivize behavior inside of your protocol, and you can basically issue it at will. And the other thing is, obviously, you can if you're issuing your own currency, you can sell it. So that's the point of view from a software writer standpoint. From a user standpoint, defaults are friction, and the friction of switching over the client in order to use Bitcoin or whatever the one world currency is supposed to be. Realistically, if there is a one world currency, it'll probably just be something boring run by the UN. So the benefit of using the one world currency versus using the small token, which is basically the liquidity, is relatively small, and it's smaller than the friction. And so because of that, people just stick with the boring default, and we'll have thousands of currencies all over the place. So another interesting case, why not delete the FBI Silk Road wallet? So back when we were talking about, why did the people on the Yap Island respect the Germans putting a cross on all their Yap stones? So one argument in this particular case is the Grimm-Sugar equilibrium, which is that, well, see, if we remove these 100,000 Bitcoins from the FBI, then that by itself creates this environment which legitimizes doing it to other people as well. And once that happens, then it's going to start happening, and the value of Bitcoin for everyone is going to drop because your Bitcoins are basically not safe anymore. Now, obviously, if someone else's Bitcoins are deleted, your Bitcoins gain in value, but the whole thing still becomes less useful because Bitcoin sort of turns into a casino, and most people have negative risk preferences. Or at least if they have positive risk preferences, they'll hopefully have all played them out on Satoshi Dice anyway. So that's one argument. Now, another argument is that the current value. So how would you delete the FBI Silk Road wallet? What you would basically say is, well, there's actually two approaches. One approach is to say that a transaction which spends those particular funds is invalid. Another approach is to take the valuation equilibrium route, which is that you actually keep track. You basically adopt a colored coins protocol where you keep track of two colors of coins. You have let's say white coins. White coins are just normal most coins, and black coins. Black coins are specifically coins originating from the FBI wallet. Now, you create a new valuation equilibrium where black coins are worth 0 and white coins are still worth the same, well, $380. So, problem with that is that valuation equilibrium is more complex to calculate. And because of that, there's this sort of strong pressure against adopting it. And the other approach, the sort of forbidding transactions as a minor approach, that's also more complex to implement, and so there's also that pressure against doing that. So the idea here is that basically you can think of a consensus system as a way of creating a complex valuation equilibrium, a complex way of assigning value to just arbitrary bits in a database, and protecting that equilibrium with, first of all, coordination problem. So problem of getting everyone to switch over to some new fork. Second is Grimm-Sugar equilibrium, and third, bounded rationality, the preference towards simplicity. So arguably, you might argue that this is what you can distill a cryptocurrency into. So last problem, scalability. So problem is, at 1 million transactions a second, no node is going to be able to process every transaction. Well, okay, maybe except the NSA, but we don't want to rely on them. So one solution is, let's split everyone into 100 consensus groups. So let's split the state space into 100 chunks, have the chunks occasionally talk to each other, but have each chunk sort of have its own consensus. Problem is, if we split into 100 groups, then an attacker can take over one of the groups, with just basically 1% of the total of the total computational power, or if we use proof of stake, 1% of the stake. And then from there, because it's one currency, that attacker is going to be able to use his control and his ability to arbitrarily overwrite that particular chunk in order to just keep on generating new currency units and sending them off to the new chain. So over time, he's going to be able to print as much money globally as he wants. So a solution is that, first of all, let's say that the attacker takes over a chain, has 95% computational power on that chain, and now the problem is there's also this other 5%. And that the 5% that are still the good guys, and they notice that they're being squashed by this terrible evil 51%, 95% miner. So what they're going to do is they're going to raise the alarm. So there's going to be some protocol where if you detect conflict inside of a blockchain, then you can suddenly increase attention. You can basically have more nodes either suddenly join the consensus group, or validate what's going on for themselves in some fashion. So basically, what we're talking about is putting a court system into a blockchain. Except, not a real human court system, but basically a computational equivalent which has the exact same benefits. Now, here's another approach that I think Chris Wilmer from Silicon Valley suggested, which is that per transaction, you randomly select some number of nodes to serve as the consensus group. So in every block, or you could do it per transaction, you could do it per block. So every block, you would, first of all, for every block, you would require that block to include a complete Merkle tree proof of the transaction execution. So the whole block is sort of a self-contained structure that can be validated all by itself without any external data. Then you pick some random 500 nodes to validate that, and you take the majority response. If the majority response is yes, then you go along and you add that block to the chain, and if the answer is no, then the block gets rejected. So this is basically the jury solution. So one problem is basically who waves the flashlight. So who has this ability to point extra attention into some particular part of the chain. So problem in law enforcement is that law enforcement attention is finite, so therefore the protocol for waving a flashlight has to be costly in some fashion. In the case of cryptocurrency, if anyone can sort of wave a flashlight onto some particular part of the state space, then that becomes a vector for DDoS attacks. So this is the problem that if you do a challenge response protocol, then what if some guy just issues challenges for everything and those have to be responded to? Problem is if issuing a challenge is expensive, then you have to subsidize it somehow. Then you might have to subsidize it somehow. Two approaches to that. One approach is to say that, okay, if there's something wrong, then whoever did the thing that's wrong is punished, and part of that punishment gets transferred over to the whistleblower. Another approach is a sort of privatization approach, which is that you realize that, okay, every single act of malfeasance is going to hurt someone, and if it hurts someone, then if someone is hurt, then they have the incentive to look out for themselves, and they have the incentive to blow the whistle, even if it costs some amount. So, first argument, problematic because it requires some protocol features. Second argument, problematic specifically because in the case of an inflation attack, there's no one particular person who is hurt an extremely large amount. Everyone else is sort of hurt slightly. So there might not be enough concentrated incentive to actually result in nodes publishing these challenges at cost. So this is a potential issue, one of the potential issues in scalability to worry about. Another problem is, well, if we look at a game theoretically, then as we mentioned in the third slide in the court system, the failure rate is going to have to end up being non-zero. Inside of a currency, that might potentially be fine. If somebody steals $15 occasionally, whatever. Inside of a Turing-complete programming platform, that's a bit more difficult. The reason being that for any kind of large computation in Ethereum, there's no way to tell how much a particular computational step is worth. And if there's a long computation, there might always be an incentive to just make one tiny transaction, which makes what looks like one tiny change in the state. But in reality, that one tiny change in the state is actually reassigning the entire ownership of the contract of some particular really huge contract from its legitimate owner over to yourself. So in order to deal with the situations and in order to push the failure rate to basically close enough to zero to be exactly zero, the whole thing might depend on altruism to some extent. So, so as a conclusion, basically cryptoeconomic protocols, cryptocurrencies, blockchains, they're social protocols. that every single ingredient inside of these protocols exists in some fashion. They rely on coordination problems. They rely on this idea of these sort of valuation equilibria where people have the incentive to value things at the same level as everyone else does. They rely on this idea of creating different Nash equilibria and trying to create a good one that's maximally stable. And now, why do we care about cryptocurrencies? Basically, the main benefits that we have are, first of all, because they're run by computers, because they're not run by humans, you have the ability to create these equilibria that are computationally complex. So in the example of the rhinestones, what potentially I could go to the island of Yap and say, I hereby grant this stone to you if and only if these three people assent to it within 72 hours, unless these 5 people say otherwise within 168. But that kind of rule and potentially even more complex ones are going to be too complicated for people to remember, and so that's why that's why basically the Yapstone people didn't go all the way into Ethereum mode. And however, we have computers, and computers can do billions of computational steps, and so they can. And the other benefit is we have low-cost communication. We can talk to people all around the world, and we can interact with people at zero cost. We can talk to people in China. We can go talk to the guys in Shenzhen that are producing our Bitcoin ASIC miners, tell them nicely to stop. Then when they don't stop, we can communicate across the Atlantic and try and figure out proof of stake algorithms with Vlad. It helps humanity move forward. Yeah, that's basically my presentation. Cool.